Welcome back to Second Breakfast. Today we are rejoining Jon Snow on the Wall. We get to a big new location. I've been excited to see how this was introduced. Did you enjoy this chapter?
I really did, and I was trying to remember how many Jon chapters we'd had so far. I was thinking we'd had more, but that's because the last Tyrion chapter was all about Jon. I mean, Tyrion too, but I was like, we saw Jon pretty recently, but no, it's been a while,
long time
since before the last Dany chapters,
right.
which we've kind of decided those Dany chapters kind of segment sections of the book. So we last saw Jon in the first section, basically, before everybody split off.
And this feels like a huge leap forward. I'm glad. I was going to highlight that too, since the last Targaryen checkpoint. Now we're checking in with him again. He seems older. It's not like he's getting to the wall. He's already enmeshed in that world.
Yeah, we skip his first day. We skip his orientation and we kind of just get right into the middle of it, which I think is really fun. Yeah, I enjoyed it. You enjoyed it too?
Yes, I did. What happened in this chapter, Maggie?
I will tell everybody. Before I do tell everybody, just a reminder, Cam and I have read some, if not all of the books, depending on which one of us it is. And we've seen the entirety of the Game of Thrones show. So we're going to spoil things. And true to form, I'm going to spoil a lot of things this time around yet again. So be warned. Okay, so this is the Game of Thrones, Jon number 3. As Cam said, Jon is already at the wall and has been there for a little while. It doesn't say how long he's been there. Based on everything, I'm guessing about a month. That's sort of my guess there. And he is down in the fighting yard practicing, swords with the other boys. They're using, I can't remember if they're using wooden swords or dulled swords, but either way, not real.
I think it's wooden.
Okay. And he is way better than everybody else fighting in this yard, and he's just beating everybody to a pulp, and nobody there likes him. They are mad and bitter that he's better at fighting. They all call him Lord Snow, sort of making fun of his kind of half noble parentage that none of these guys have. And Jon doesn't like any of them. He thinks they're all mean, and he's like, well, I just be better fighters. Oh, your problem is Jon is not fitting in at all. And so Jon, sort of wins this fight and then goes off to just to sulk. And we learned that he's really finding the wall incredibly disappointing. Again, he's not getting along with anybody. He really misses his family. And also it's really, really cold. He really makes it a point to complain about how cold it is. And in his defense, I would too. And so he's, sulking by himself. But then some of the boys approach him. One of them is a guy named Gren, who he was fighting in the yard. And Gren is all mad that Jon hurt his wrist. And he's like, you broke my wrist. And so they're messing with him. They're taunting him. They call his mother a whore, and this really sets Jon off, and they basically start fighting each other. Jon is doing a good job fighting back. He's actually doing quite well considering it's 4 against 1. But then Donald Noy, the armorer, they're in the armory at this point. So the armorer shows up and breaks up the fight. It's like, what are y'all doing? This is ridiculous. And he sends everybody away, but he keeps Jon behind. And he sort of chastises Jon for rising to these guys' taunts and says, we need as many people on the wall as we can. You're not going to help anything by killing these guys. Sort of saying without saying, yeah, these guys suck, but we need them, so don't try to kill them. And Jon is getting all defensive about his mother. And Noy just sort of has this talk with Jon and kind of sets him straight and says, a lot of these guys, their mothers were actually whores. None of these guys had masters at arms to teach them how to fight when they were growing up. None of them had the kind of childhood that you had. And Jon is still kind of defensive, and he's like, well, they're being mean to me. They're not being nice to me. And he's like, you're acting like you're better than them. He's like, but I am better than them. And he's like, Jon, get it together. And so he just kind of sets him straight. And Jon sort of feels guilty and ashamed and kind of realizes, oh, I've kind of been something of a dick to these guys. And so then he just goes off on his own and he's looking out at the wall. And then Tyrion joins him. Remember, Tyrion is still here. He traveled with them to the wall, and so he's still here. And they have another of their little talks. Tyrion is, of course, so smart and observant, and picks up that Jon is really curious about what lies beyond the wall, and also gives him advice not to let people calling him names hurt or upset him. And so then they go off to just to get some food, into their dining hall. And Sir Alliser Thorne, who is the master at arms, the guy who trains them and stuff, he comes up and says that the Lord Commander wants to see Jon right away. And Jon's like, what? Why? What happened? And then he's wondering, oh, something happened to Uncle Benjen, because Benjen Stark, who is Ned's brother, who escorted Jon to the wall and all that, he's a ranger at the Night's Watch, so he has gone out with a group beyond the wall to check out some stuff, and he hasn't been back, but he's supposed to have been back by now, so he's nervous about that. So first he thinks that he's being summoned because something happened to Benjen. But that's actually not what happened. There's been a letter from Robb. And so Jon is panicked and he thinks something has happened to Bran. So he like rushes to go see the Lord Commander. The Lord Commander gives him the letter and he learns that Bran has awoken. And so he is incredibly relieved, overjoyed that Bran is going to live. He like runs back down and he like tells Tyrion, and it's really cute and he's really excited. He even apologizes to Gren for hurting his wrist and says like, hey, you know, I've had that happen to me before. It really hurts. I can show you how to block it. He's trying to be nice and sort of make peace. Alistair Thorne overhears this conversation and he's just not a nice guy. He kind of sneers and he says, oh, so Jon, now you're going to try to train the guys. You're doing my job. And he says that it'd be easier to train a wolf to juggle than for Jon to train these guys well. And Jon, like in his confidence and joy, I guess, kind of snarkily responds back and says that he'll take that wager. He'd love to see Ghost juggle, you know, his direwolf. And there's like this silence and then everybody laughs. But then Thorne is like pissed and he just kind of looks at Jon and says like, that was a big mistake. And that's how the chapter ends. So it was a fun one. It sort of takes you on a journey. And like Jon, I think this happens every time I think we see Jon. He just goes through a big emotional journey and has to figure something out and go through some sulking and pondering and learning from people. And is just, we're seeing him really grow and evolve and change in just the, 3 or 4 chapters we've seen him in.
Yeah, it's been a crash course into adulthood. I want to pull back to something that we played with a few weeks ago because enjoying this chapter just in the process of reading it, I thought it was great. It was fun. The action was interesting. The setting was fascinating. I loved it and had absolutely nothing to say. And then I started kind of doing something else and digging under the surface. And I think that's where there's a lot of stuff happening here. If you're new to the series, like we were when we first read this, I think there'd be a lot to pick up on. Here. It's a whole new setting. It's a new cast of characters. Obviously, that's the main takeaway. But I think under the surface, there's a lot happening here. And a number of episodes ago, I talked about this idea of narrative intervention. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of that happening here. Again, I have 3 examples I want to play with.
Okay.
I think what George is doing here is sort of a quiet critique of Jon with other characters and other problems that he raises up out of nothing for Jon to confront and deal with. The first one is that this chapter is mostly a string of asides with compassionate avuncular advisors.
Yeah.
You have a conversation with Benjen Stark in the beginning of the chapter. You have a conversation with Donal Noy after the fight in the armory, and then you have a conversation with Tyrion. And these are all 3 guys giving Jon life advice, but also they're giving him second chances and guidance in a way that no one else at the Wall is getting.
Yeah. He's being kind of shepherded and almost babied a little bit. Yes,
exactly. He's getting set on the right course in a way that no one else is. And that's an unbelievable advantage.
Sure, yeah.
And there's a discussion throughout the chapter of special privileges. When one of them is talking to Jon, they're saying, you expected your last name to get you easy favor here, and that's not how the Wall works. But I think George's whole point here is, it totally is how it works, but also that Jon isn't clocking all of this special privilege that he is getting.
Right.
From these 3 guys taking him aside and trying to fix his behavior with the explicit warning that these other guys that you're making fun of and goofing on in public and shaming, they're going to kill you.
Right. Yeah.
They're not helping everyone on the Wall in that same way.
You're so right.
He is getting a special access. And as Jon is being grumpy about not getting enough special privilege from these people, he retires to his cell and hangs out with Ghost.
His direwolf. That nobody else has.
No one else got to bring their pets
to
the military prison.
Right.
It's very funny.
Right. Well, and it's very interesting, too, because Jon has led this life where he has been the one who is the outcast and basically the victim. And so I think he's so used to that victim position that it kind of is backfiring here. And he's like expecting that to continue and or at least that he'll be on equal footing with everybody because he's assuming, remember, he has his assumption that the Night's Watch is full of all of these not in terms of class noble, but like in morality, noble guys who are like there to save the day and protect the realm. And it's actually, no, it's like rapists and criminals
yeah.
and outcasts and terrible people.
And I sympathize with Jon because he's young and he's got a lot of stuff thrown at him, and he has been treated unfairly, and he's an outsider.
Yeah.
And I get the disappointment of going to this place where you think you're going to finally be one of the lost boys, and he's just, once again, an outcast among outcasts.
Yeah.
I get that. But also, the way that he doesn't clock any of these special privileges he is getting, I thought that was sort of heightened by Tyrion's role in this chapter. Because
really
you see all these guys running around and working, and Tyrion is just like taking an endless tour.
Yeah, he doesn't have to do anything. He gets to stay in the nice fancy chambers and just hang out and drink all day. He has no responsibilities.
He eats and talks with all of the heads at the wall, and all of the smartest higher ups that he just gets to
because he's royal. With. Yeah,
right. So he does have that easy access and easy favor that Jon maybe thought he would have.
Yeah, I think so too.
Or that Jon doesn't realize he kind of has.
Or that he feels he deserves or something.
It's not malicious in either case, but I enjoyed that Tyrion was almost an exaggeration of Jon's role in this chapter.
I like that, especially because we've set these two characters up as being like mirrors of each other, as these like outsider gargoyle characters.
So I liked George positioning Tyrion like that as a point of contrast that I think heightens our awareness of what's going on with Jon. The other thing that really spoke to me for narrative intervention here is how much Jon continues to miss Arya, who he views as this fellow free spirit. She's the other scrappy Stark. But in his classism and judgment of everyone else at the Night's Watch, I found that he had much more in common in this chapter with Sansa.
Yeah.
And like Sansa, he doesn't know he's being classist and condescending.
That's very true.
The best line of this chapter is, "You act like you're better than them." I'm glad you highlighted that before, but I found that fascinating for George. Instead of just again and again in absentia strengthening this connection between Arya and Jon, to draw some of these unhappy comparisons between Sansa and Jon. I think that really furthers both characters.
Yeah, I like that. And even when Jon is thinking about his family, he says that he even misses Sansa, which you probably would have never heard him say at any other point in his life. But he's feeling so isolated and so like he doesn't fit in with these people. And so like he doesn't like these people, that he's even missing Sansa, who he's actually being very similar to in this moment. Love that.
The third narrative intervention I wanted to play with here, and this is, again, looking at this subliminal level, trying to see what I can wring out of this chapter. I started seeing George R. R. Martin's invisible hand, that term as it applies to the economy and these sort of things. I think that is the role of the author. Obviously, everything is being constructed by George R. R. Martin, but I think sometimes he's pushing characters in a way that reveals something about them to the audience, where sometimes it's more for us as the reader than it is for the character to be furthered in their storyline. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
I think there's some of that happening here because I kept getting these glimpses in this chapter at the return of the White Walkers. And I think that's George trying to keep that idea alive for us more than it is supposed to be on the immediate horizon for Jon. Because Jon doesn't know about the White Walkers. He doesn't know they exist.
Yeah.
We know. We've seen them.
Yes.
But there's a danger in forgetting about them. So I think there are two glimpses of the White Walkers in this chapter.
Okay.
One is just the wall. The wall is the White Walkers in absentia. It is a massive manifestation of the mental real estate those things take up in this world. Because the wall is this clumsy defense against the fantastical unknown. It's icy, blue, cold, and dead.
Sure, yeah.
All of the things that the White Walkers are.
And older than like anything else in the realm, too.
And because we know the White Walkers are on the horizon, that they're real and they're fairly close by,
right,
it makes the wall almost acts as the elephant in the room that keeps the White Walkers forefront in our minds. The second thing is Benjen Stark's apparent disappearance, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
Because it yanks us right back to the prologue. And as we settle into more and more different courts and parts of this world of Westeros, it's easy to lose sight of that prologue.
Yes. It's been so long since we addressed it.
Yeah, and it's hard to grapple with, okay, every Stark kid now gets their own cast of characters, and I have to keep it all straight, and we're pinballing back and forth between them.
Right.
I loved how the immediacy with which this chapter brought me back to the terror of those early scenes in the prologue, and the way it advanced it, because we care about Benjen, we don't want him to go through that and be killed. But also that uncomfortable realization underneath that all those poor guys who were ripped to shreds by the White Walkers, now Jon is right there in that position.
Yeah.
So it humanizes those guys 15 chapters later, and it adds all of this unseen dread onto Jon.
Well, I love that. And did you notice also that when they're talking about Benjen, they like very quickly and casually mention Sir Waymar Royce, who's one of the guys who was killed in the prologue. I couldn't remember at first. I was like, I know that name. And then I thought about it for a second and I was like, oh my God, it's the guy in the prologue. But of course, none of these guys know that he's dead. None of them know any of that happened. But so yeah, it's just that little, like tiny little, you might miss it, but if you're paying attention, you're like, you're connecting these dots and you're like, oh shit. It's very, very cool.
You said that the last Jon chapter we kind of got was the Tyrion chapter when he was in there. And I think having the connection between those guys be so tight. I mean, to the point that when I reread these books and just read those 2 chapters, that's because of the work done here in these early chapters that I think that connection is so strong, even as they go their separate ways and never meet again as far as the published books go. I think it's important to get some space from that connection in this chapter because Jon is nowhere near, as to what you said before, observant as Tyrion is. So I think these 3 narrative interventions together, they sort of humble Jon and make him more interesting as his own man. Because we see the White Walkers hanging over him. I think that's one intervention. We see how similar he is to Sansa in their sort of charming adolescent ignorance. And then we see the special access that he's getting here. And I think that begins us on the long road of Jon being groomed for command. You know, you get to look ahead and see some Aragorn on the horizon for him. I loved how much of that was set up almost to the audience more than it was consciously set up to Jon.
Yes, I really, really like that. And actually, that's very in line with the main thing I was thinking about when I was reading this, thinking about Jon's future / past / like what we come to learn about him, what he comes to learn about himself over the course of this story. And that was really tied in with, you know, as George seems to enjoy doing, like not even a stylistic choice, just a word choice, metaphor, theme, motif that plays throughout this chapter. It's not about seeing and sight and silence, don't worry. Some of that was in here, but I think we've done that to its end and we're good there. Unless it comes up again in a fun way. I don't really think I'm going to talk about it anymore. But what I did notice here was quite a lot of mentions of either the words or words similar to ice and fire. Obviously, this whole saga is called A Song of Ice and Fire, but it's really prevalent here. And I'm thinking about it really not just like the bringing up of those things on their own individually, but them together in like an oxymoronic way. And if you'll recall, I noticed that in the prologue, there was a lot of stuff like nothing burned like the cold. That was one of the first things I noticed when we were reading these books in this way. And that really comes back here, specifically around Jon, not just like in the place that we're in, not just in, you know, this setting, but specifically with Jon, especially. We have things like sweat trickled icily down his back. The frosty morning air felt good on his face. Why would the frosty air feel good if it's cold all the time, right? And then he's like his sweat soaked stuff that he has to put down.
The boiled leathers and the black wool.
Right.
Ugh.
It says that coal burned in the iron braziers, but Jon found himself shivering.
No deodorant.
His breath is steaming in the morning air. Jon was cold with rage. I loved that one. Often rage is described in this like fiery, warm, hot kind of way, but Jon was cold with rage. We see this with Jon, but then we also see this with the way the wall is described. The wall is blazing blue and crystalline in the sunlight. So it's like blazing, but it's blue and cold and icy. So it's like fiery and icy at the same time.
Like the blue fire from the dragon.
Right. There's a whole, I didn't even get into it. There's a whole thing where like Jon is like thinking about if the wall were to come down, the whole world would end. And so I was of course thinking
Wasn't
about
that beautiful?
when the wall does in fact burn down. Yeah, it was incredible. And then they're in this hall that's drafty, even with the fire roaring in its great hearth. So there's this like push and pull, almost dichotomy of fire and ice throughout this. And of course, when I think about that, anytime you kind of zoom out and think about those concepts, you think about ice being the winter that is coming and fire is like the Targaryens. Like that's usually what I think about. And so, of course, if we're connecting Jon with fire, we're going to think about Jon's true parentage, his Targaryen parentage. And so I was certainly thinking about that. And I think that's one of the many hints that George drops to us, the reader, throughout the course of this book and probably beyond, about who Jon's real parents are. And then, of course, in this chapter, there's a whole chunk about Jon's mother, and they're calling her a whore, and Jon is really upset about it. And it says that Jon doesn't know anything about his mom. He admits that sort of in his own mental narration, but says that he does dream about her, and he imagines that she's like highborn and beautiful with kind eyes. I went back and looked in the first Ned chapter when he and Robert go down to the, don't you dare, don't do it. When he and Robert go down to the crypt. If you know what we're talking about, leave a comment below. But her face is not described as having kind eyes, unfortunately. I thought that would have been so fun, but it's not. I think that would have been too easy. But we do know that she was beautiful, and we of course know that Lyanna Stark is highborn. So I still liked that that little hint there.
That's really good. Yeah.
So we're thinking about Jon's parentage, and so the fire is his Targaryen thing, and the ice is it's the wall, but it's also that Jon has to learn to become cold and hard, like at the wall, right? And so as I was sort of thinking about this, I thought, I'm just going to do a little counting moment. I went through the chapter, and I'm sure I missed things here and there, but I counted the number of times that words like fire, hot, heat, blaze, like anything that reminded me of fire or anything like that. And then all the number of times we see words like ice, cold, drafty, shiver, et cetera, et cetera. There were 20 fire mentions and 13 ice mentions. Now, again, I don't think George went through and made sure that there were more fire than ice mentions. I don't think that's what he was doing. I'm not saying that is an intentional choice. I just think it's interesting and it's fun to think about. There is more fire than ice in this chapter by a pretty good margin, 20 to 13. That's almost a 50% increase, right? I'm going to call that like a 30-40% increase difference. And so I think maybe what that could tell us is that right now Jon's Targaryenness makes him stand out. Like that makes him unique. He is unique from his Stark family, and he's unique from his Wall family, his Night's Watch family. And so he's sort of standing out and is like in contrast to everybody else. Because the other thing about these like fire and ice mentions, like I said earlier, is not just that they're present, but that they are presented together in a way to like hype up that contrast. Because why would a chapter that's all about the wall, that's all about how icy and cold and awful it is, why would it have so many mentions of fire? Often when fire or words connected to fire are mentioned, they are sort of like a way to show us how cold it is by contrast. So like if someone's breath is steaming in the air, it's because it's so cold. There's a fire burning, in the hall, but it's still so drafty and cold in there. And so it's a way to sort of beef up and like that and increase the intensity of the cold and to demonstrate how intense that really, really is. And so I think Jon, again, like that contrast is really important because Jon's Targaryenness is making him so contrasted with everybody else around him. And so I think what's happening is that the farther north he goes, the deeper into the cold he gets, the more he stands out, the more isolated he is because of that fiery part of him or whatever. But I think what's going to have to happen now going forward is that he's going to need to learn to adapt and become colder and sort of tone the fiery Targaryenness down, because if he rises to every challenge with violence and intensity, he's going to get himself killed. Like if he acts like
every Targaryen we ever meet.
Exactly. If he acts like King Aerys, he's not going to last long. He can't act like Lord Stark either, because times is tough and you got to be harsh, and especially once he goes over the wall and crosses into the north, he's gonna he can't be noble and like all good like hero, right? He's gonna have to sort of adapt and face some pretty harsh realities, think like Craster, right? That kind of thing. So he's gonna have to sort of adapt this like cold iciness and balance it with his like born to rule, like noble blood. That's the fire side of him. He's going to have to find that balance to go towards the like leadership role that he's going to find in this new part of his life, sort of like you hinted at. So that's sort of what I was clocking through that fire and ice.
That's
stuff.
Fascinating, because I was looking for, we've been talking about couplets for a few weeks, and I think there's this idea every week that we're trying to chase the couplet or close the couplet and see what is returning from the previous chapter in a more explicit or fiery way that makes it almost explodes the metaphor. And I was looking for the things that returned here, and I think you did a great job with the dual identities that return here. Last week in Catelyn's chapter, we were talking about her Tully side and her Stark side.
I didn't even think about that. That's great. I love that.
Here you have Jon's dual identities. So that's right there. You could call that closing that couplet.
Awesome.
I also think you have a lead character who's kind of a Stark, kind of not a Stark, seeing these conspiracies all around them. Also, you've got a little crow nod. The crow or the raven that brings the news about Bran.
There are crows mentioned too here, and like a guy's feeding him corn. We see crows up in the rafters when like a fight is breaking out. So yeah.
And the chapter ends with kind of an uncharacteristic cliffhanger, much like Catelyn's chapter did. Here you get the bombshell revelation that Bran's awake. Last time it was that the knife belonged to Tyrion. So there's a structural similarity as well as that sort of exploded emotional interiority that you already played with the dual identities.
That's true.
But the one that really spoke to me, and the couplet that I saw closing here, maybe more than any of the other ones, is a feeling you foregrounded last week that I argued with at the time, but I saw it here, and I want to give that credit.
Okay.
Because my sneaking suspicion as I went through these 11 pages is, oh God, this character might be way out of their depth.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I said that Catelyn was last week. So you're saying Jon is here?
I think that question is being dangled in front of us in both chapters.
Okay. So what about this chapter makes it seem like Jon is at it? I mean, we've touched on it a bit, I suppose. He's just acting like he's better than everybody, and
he's stacking up formidable enemies. We know that the White Walkers are right around the corner, and he doesn't. We know that Benjen might be dead. We know that Tyrion, his only friend, is about to leave.
We also think right now that Tyrion was the one who had Bran killed. Like, if you're a first-time reader, that's what you're thinking. So you read when Tyrion apologizes thinking that Bran has died, you're thinking, you lying piece of shit. It's
not that dissimilar from seeing Catelyn in King's Landing.
That's really, really interesting. I think that's really cool. And the biggest like couplet echo that I found in here, I think further supports that. The thing that really stuck out to me, apart from the little bit of Bran's dream coming true here, in Bran's dream it says like Jon was going to forget what it felt like to be warm, and here in this chapter it says in a few years he would forget what it felt like to be warm. So I thought that was fun. But the biggest one that I noticed, the one that stood out to me the most, was the way that the wall is described and how it reminded me of the way King's Landing is described when Catelyn arrives, especially the Red Keep. If you don't mind, I'm going to read those two passages, and we can maybe talk about them together. So I'll do the wall first. So this is just a chunk of it, but it says, almost 700 feet high it stood, by the way, I thought this would be fun. I feel like sometimes when we mention like dimensions, people just eyes roll back. 700 feet is massive. The tallest pyramid of Giza, the Great Pyramids, is I think about 450 feet tall, and that thing is massive. The Eiffel Tower is around 900 feet tall, and then like modern skyscrapers are often over 1,000 feet, but that's with modern steel technology.
They're not made of ice.
Right. And so if the wall, which was built like 1,000 years before this story even takes place, and this story is basically taking place, I'm going to guess, 12th century, like equivalent, like technology wise, it's the Middle Ages. Okay. You look skeptical. Do you even know anything about the Middle Ages?
No. I can do the 1500s. Anything before that is just Stone Age.
That's kind of what I'm guessing. And so the fact that this structure is 700 feet high, taller than the biggest pyramid, and just a couple hundred feet shorter than the Eiffel Tower, which is made of like metal, like that's amazing. Okay. So anyway, massive. Almost 700 feet high it stood, 3 times the height of the tallest tower in the stronghold it sheltered. His uncle said the top was wide enough for a dozen armored knights to ride abreast. The gaunt outlines of huge catapults and monstrous wooden cranes stood sentry up there, like the skeletons of great birds, and among them walked men in black as small as ants. Okay, so just hold that in your brain. Now let me describe the Red Keep from Catelyn's point of view. And above it all, frowning down from Aegon's high hill, was the Red Keep, 7 huge drum towers crowned with iron ramparts, an immense grim barbican, vaulted halls and covered bridges, barracks and dungeons and granaries, massive curtain walls studded with archers' nests, all fashioned of pale red stone. So obviously these two descriptions are unique and separate and different, but I just thought like the way that the Red Keep is described as like frowning down at them, and the way that the wall is like looming over them, and like the Red Keep has these 7 towers and the wall is 700 feet tall, and they both just have this sense of feeling massive and overpowering and overwhelming and scary, even though both of these are meant to be like displays of power that should make us feel safe. The wall is supposed to protect us from everything beyond it and make us feel safe. And the Red Keep is, you know, the castle where the king lives. We should all feel like, yes, that's a big seat of power, but like I feel protected. I feel like, you know, this castle and this king is keeping my kingdom and myself and my family safe. They're both supposed to be these sources of comfort and security, and instead they're both these looming, terrifying things. And I thought that was really fun. And they also are kind of on these like separate edges of the world. The wall is of course at the north, and King's Landing isn't all the way south, but it's basically like the edge of the 7 kingdoms, basically. And like we know later, that's where massive battles are going to happen. Like that sort of precipice is really important.
They also, I love that comparison. I love that couplet between those two. But they also almost both feel like echoes of their former selves. Because the narration talks about the wall being manned by 500 men when it used to have 10 times that number.
Yeah. It's kind of fallen into disarray.
Yeah, and it's a skeleton crew now. It's past its former glory. In the same way, last chapter, we got that interesting little bit of history on the original founding of King's Landing. When you saw the real majesty of the Targaryen crown having this massive red keep that they were in control of, instead of the skeleton crew of King Robert, who's out to lunch and doesn't give a shit, and then you have the Lannisters kind of running things.
Right.
Like, there's not a forceful ruler in King's Landing. There's not a Targaryen at home. There's not the dragon circling overhead.
I was going to say, like, you don't have the dragons anymore. That's all fallen into ruin. I think even in Catelyn's chapter, it says something about how, like, the Sept of Baelor is sort of fallen into ruin. Like, it's all, like, both of these things are shades of their former selves, and they're no longer these symbols of, like, security and safety. Instead, they're, like, crumbling, looming threats. It's really fascinating.
Dangerous relics.
To see, to see the both ends of this land of Westeros are actually falling apart at the seams.
That's fantastic. Well, we're going with yours.
Great. Let's do that. Sounds
Forget
good.
everything I said about my couplets. Yours is more fun.
No, yours were also really good. And I think they support each other, and it's all very fun and interesting.
That's fun. Yeah, see, I feel like I keep getting bored of our ongoing theories, but I'm enjoying the couplet thing lately.
Yeah, that's been a fun one. Let's keep it going for sure.
So next chapter, we are going to return to
Ned.
Oh, that'll be number 5.
Yeah.
Cool. So he's really taken the floor now.
Actually, I think this might be his 4th one.
Either way, he's now going to start to pull ahead of the pack as our big lead character.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's
cool.
going to be good. Yeah,
interesting.
So I'm assuming they'll be arriving at King's Landing.
A little bit
of next one.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
I'm sure he'll meet up with Catelyn and all kinds of stuff. So things are about to get exciting. Not that they haven't been already, but
I like when people threaten Littlefinger, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
A bit of housekeeping. This past Tuesday, I'm talking about basically the month of April so far. We are continuing our Dune coverage, but we're doing it a little more sporadically. It's like every other week is the Dune books that we've already recorded episodes for. We also returned to the world of Middle-earth a little bit.
We did.
We got to see all 3 Lord of the Rings movies in theaters a few months ago, and we recorded an episode at the time that's just now coming out about what it's like to revisit Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings after covering it in the intense way that we did, and even just talking about what this series is like in 2024, what you notice in the movies, what the theatrical experience is like. That was a really fun chat.
It was, yeah.
And I believe we have the Children of Dune episode that has just come out where we're talking about
you're right, yeah.
The third Dune novel.
Yeah, that was also really fun. And that's actually, is that our last Dune
that we've
episode
recorded?
That we've recorded so far? Yeah.
We'll probably keep soldiering on.
Yeah.
We've got a big pipeline we've got to get out to. We've got a lot of episodes lined up.
I can't even tell. We have so many episodes lined up because Dune sort of like we decided kind of in an impromptu way to do Dune. It really kind of threw off our planned schedule, but that means that we have a ton of stuff that we're excited to share with y'all. So
it also means that more timely things and more out of our element things like that conversation about book formats, those things are now being moved over to Patreon, where you can get at least one, usually 2 bonus episodes a month and access to the whole back catalog of all the bonus episodes we've done over there. So I'm excited for the episodes we have outlined for Patreon as well.
Patreon's a fun place. Go check it out. We've got stuff in the description. It's $2 a month. All kinds of fun things on Patreon.
And as a little tease, we're looking at doing something that is George R.R. Martin related for the Patreon.
Yes, in the next couple months. Maybe if you're paying attention to things, you probably can guess what that is.
Yeah. What else is going up in a few months?
I'm going to leave it at that. But yeah.
Right.
Just a heads up.
Thank you very much for listening, joining us again for this wonderful conversation about John chapter 3.
Yeah, let us know what you think about anything we said, any thoughts you had about this chapter. If you're on YouTube, you can comment below. Also, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. It's amazing if you do that. Otherwise, if you're just listening on a podcast platform, you can send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram, send us a DM or comment over there, Second Breakfast Pod. And of course, if you're on Patreon, just comment below on the Patreon post. Easy peasy. I guess that's it.
We'll be back on Tuesday with a brand new episode. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Bye.